Now, before the horse gets too far out of the barn, I think you and I need to have an up-close and personal conversation. I think you're spending way too much of your time, your energy, and effort worried and concerning yourselves with the wrong thing. You see, you're concerned that if you get freight from shippers, that freight is not going to be movable because it's too cheap. That's not your job to try and predetermine whether or not freight is too cheap or not. Your job is to take that freight to the marketplace and allow for truck drivers, carriers to determine whether the freight is movable, whether it's too cheap. Some of you have never moved freight before, or you're moving very little freight, and you have the audacity to predetermine in your mind that freight is too cheap. That's going to cause you to miss out on a whole lot of freight. Some of you are already thinking in your mind, just because shippers send out freight to you and that freight already has pricing on it, that you're not going to be able to get it moved because you can't make profit. That's not necessarily true. Sometimes you're going to be able to make good profit on that load. In this video today, as a matter of fact, I'm going to take you in and I'm going to show you how you should handle this situation. So come on inside, sit back, relax, and let me put you up on game. I think I know where this comes from, and I think it comes from a really good place. You have a good heart, and you've heard all of these horror stories about how truckers are treated unfairly. And the thing that you come into with this business is the notion in your mind to say, hey, I'm not going to be that way. I am going to treat carriers like they should be treated. I am going to give them fair pricing. And that is what you should do. But I also want you to understand that your business is to mind your business. That's what your job is on a day in and day out basis, to make sure that you take your business from where it is right now to being a successful business. And in order to do that, you have to put your mind and put your attention on your business. The carrier will take care of his own business. Don't try to be the savior of the carrier's business. I promise you that carrier will take care of himself, or he won't be in business. Now, shippers send freight to you in different ways. Sometimes they send freight and they request that you provide pricing for them, and then sometimes they send out freight and the freight already has a pricing on it. Sometimes we are a little bit leery about moving freight that already has pricing, because in our minds, shippers don't price freight so that freight brokers can make profit. Freight brokers have to price freight so they can make profit. Now, of course, I like the freight that when the shippers send it out, they ask me for that bid. I like to provide bids back because I always or usually make more money on freight that I provide the bids back to. But that's not always the case that you get that type of freight, so I'm completely okay with moving freight that shippers already send pricing on. Because what I've noticed is that even when I get freight like that, I can still make profits. Now, are the profit margins thinner? Yes, but that's okay because sometimes I can move that freight in large volume and make even more money. So don't have this idea in your mind just because you see freight that already has pricing that you need to move on from it. Because if you do that, you're going to miss out on money that you could be making. And where did you get the idea that the freight is too cheap? Where did that ever come from? Have you done the research in the lane to know that you're too low in that lane? And what type of research did you do? What I do when I go into a lane is the first thing that I look at is trucking capacity. Trucking capacity will always tell the story. It's going to tell me exactly what's going on in that lane. And I already know that if I'm priced too low and the trucking capacity is low in that lane, we're going to have some problems. So the idea that a lane is too low has to be based on something, should be based on the conditions in that particular lane. And it's your job to go into that lane and find out exactly what's going on. If you go into a lane and it's a certain season and it has a price in that lane, let's just say $2.30 a mile, and it's really cold outside, ice on the road, well, and that price is no longer $2.30 a mile. It might have shot up to $3.50 a mile, $4 a mile. So you have to understand the different things that happen, the dynamics that happen in the lane, seasonality, truck capacity, fuel surcharge, different things that are happening in that lane that would affect the rate. That way, when you start to take the pen to the paper to get down to what the rate will be, you are taking all of these things into consideration before actually giving a rate. So now another question that you may want to ask yourself is, when is the lane too cheap? Is it too cheap because you don't make what you want in profit, or is it too cheap because the carrier says it's too cheap? Now, the thing about the carrier saying it's too cheap, it could be that way for one carrier and could be a totally different way for another carrier. That's why I believe that we have to go into these lanes and do extensive research. Talk to different carriers to find out what the word is out there, how carriers feel about this load and this number. Not just one carrier, but collectively what the carriers are saying about that load. Because how I look at it is, if I make $500 on a $3,000 load, that's a sufficient profit. But I'm not going to say if I make less than that, if I make $400 or $300, then it's too cheap. No, I just made less than I wanted to make. So you have to determine what profit margins you want to be at, and then that can help you determine where you need to be at in price. But let the carrier determine whether or not it's too cheap for him. He'll let you know. And then sometimes, at some point, we have to deal with the fear that's inside of us. False evidence appearing real, but it's very real to you right now. And the real deal is you're calling it cheap freight. That's just a mask. What's behind the mask is you're afraid to negotiate with carriers. That makes you uncomfortable. You don't know what they're going to say, and you may have had an encounter with a carrier and they have been rude to you, and you were a little bit off-put by that. You don't know how to take them, so you would rather not have to negotiate with them. And when you get a load from a shipper that already has pricing, you already make it up in your mind that the load is cheap. And then you might take it to a load board and you talk to two carriers and they tell you that, hey, this is not enough money in this load, and you automatically put it in your mind and say, hey, I can't make this load work. So then it may be fair to say that the problem that you really need to deal with is the fear that is within you to negotiate with carriers. But now that's something that's always going to be there. That's something that you're always going to have to do, because wouldn't it be great if you never had to negotiate, if the numbers were always right, where you got your profit, the carrier got his great profit, and everything worked out? But that's never going to happen. There's always going to be fluctuations. There's always going to be times where you have to go in and negotiate. Do you have to negotiate on every single load and be a hardline negotiator? No, but there will be times where you need to negotiate in those lanes. You want to get better at doing it. How do you get better at negotiating? Well, you have to start doing it. You have to start going into the marketplace and negotiating with carriers. That's how you get better and more comfortable with negotiating. And also negotiating on the shipper side. It's not just about negotiating on the carrier side. Some freight brokers have a thing where they don't do any negotiating on the carrier side, on the shipper side, and then they take all of their negotiation expertise to the carrier side. Well, no, you need to negotiate on both sides sometimes. But you need to decide when you need to negotiate. The numbers will determine that. So that's what I wanted to share with you today.
Please like, subscribe, and click the bell so you don't miss anything.
If you want to learn more about the freight broker business, I'll leave a link in the description. It's my 5-video series titled How the Load Movement Process Works. It will give you a look into the freight broker business, let you see how it works. I'll bring you into my office and let you see me in here talking to shippers, talking to carriers. That way you can get a really good idea of how this business works before you come into it. And just in case you might want to know how freight brokers use load boards to search for trucks, post their loads, and source rates, I'll leave a free tutorial right here. So until the next time, I wish you the very best in your life and business. See you at the top, because the bottom is much too crowded.